So let's just start to propose some answers that might better meet the evidence. So on the tenants article, I saw a couple of things. I started with the impact zones of the towers because I thought that was interesting that a company called Marsh & McLennan occupied all of the floors in the North Tower where the plane impacted and the fires kind of raged there. Marsh & McLennan was this big insurance broker, financial company. And those floors that Marsh occupied were the exact floors that had been updated for fireproofing in the few years before 2011. So 110 stories, and there was only 8 of them that got full floor fireproofing upgrades, and all 8 of them were Marsh & McLennan, floors 93 to 101, where the plane impacted. So I thought that was pretty odd. Started looking at Marsh. I thought, yeah, that seemed odd to me. And started looking at Marsh and some of the people that worked for them, and I noticed there were a couple of Bush family members, like Craig Stapleton, who is the husband of George W. Bush's cousin, and he was there, and he used to be Bush's partner in the Texas Rangers deal that made him so much money. I also noticed L. Paul Bremer. This guy stood out just glaringly. L. Paul Bremer was the 2 years later the Iraq occupation governor, so people may remember him better for that. But on 9/11, he was the CEO of Marsh Crisis, a division of Marsh & McLennan, and he had an office in the South Tower. So when I started looking at these floors in the different areas of the towers, I noticed that these matched up, and Marsh had not only the entire impact zone of the North Tower, but they had a subsidiary right in the middle of the South Tower, and L. Paul Bremer had an office there. And Bremer was one of the first people to start giving us the official story for what happened. He somehow survived the day. I don't know how. He had his office there, but instead of going to his office, he had showed up on all the news stations telling us Osama bin Laden was responsible, and probably Iraq and Iran also, and that we really ought to start a massive war against those people. So that's interesting. The other thing that was interesting about Bremer was he was a director for a Japanese company called Komatsu that had just patented a thermite demolition device in 1996. So, and published the patent. So that I thought was interesting enough that maybe it should be investigated. Over in the South Tower impact zone, there's a couple of companies that occupied that. One of them was called Aon, and again, Bush's first cousin Jim Pierce worked right there in the South Tower impact zone. He had a meeting scheduled for that day. Then he moved across the street to the Millennium Hotel, and so he survived the day miraculously. There's also Baseline Financial right there in the impact zone. This guy named Joseph Kasputis was really interesting to me because he was very closely related to the Department of Energy, and also just above him was a company called the Washington Group, and they were also very closely related to the Department of Energy and had just purchased a company called Morrison Knudsen that did hundreds of demolition projects for the Army Corps of Engineers. So there are a lot of people in these buildings, tenants in these buildings, that had connections to demolition technology. They had connections to the Department of Energy. They had a lot of connections to the Bush family for whatever reason. And so that's just that one article stands on its own. And then I went to the security design companies and contractors and found Kroll. A lot of people know about Kroll. It's this massive security company that also used to be called the CIA of Wall Street, and for their investigative work. And Kroll designed the security systems for the World Trade Center complex after the 1993 bombing. And the design was implemented by a couple of companies, one of them being this company called Strategic, that people often talk about, this Wirt Walker, and his being a relative of the Bush family. He's kind of just a distant relative, but he's a very interesting person. He appears to be connected to the CIA, not only through his father, who worked for the CIA and the DIA, but through other circumstantial pieces of evidence. But Strategic Walker, he hired a bunch of people from the Carlyle Group, a subsidiary of the Carlyle Group. So his chief operating officer, he took him from BDM International, which is the Carlyle Group subsidiary. And BDM had a history in black projects. So Strategic is very interesting for all these connections to not only Walker, but Marvin Bush, who was the president's brother, was a director at Strategic. And they hired all these Carlyle Group people, including McDaniel, and they implemented the overall security plan right up to the day the buildings fell down. So I thought that was interesting.
I agree. Totally amazing.
It seems worth investigating, Todd. I think that's the main thing. If we have to, we'll go forward and we'll do all the footwork, and we'll make it as painfully obvious as possible that there are a lot of people like these people I'm naming who are at least as suspicious as the 19 hijackers that were named, at least, if not far more so. And they did benefit, and they did have access to the technology, and they did have access to the buildings, which, when explosives were placed in the buildings, those are the questions you want answered.
Kevin, I want to get to the cleanup side of it too. That's important. You found some really interesting stuff related to the cleanup and people involved in the cleanup. But before we go there, I'd like to talk about Rudy Giuliani for a minute or two. You told me some stuff about Rudy Giuliani that I had never known. For one thing, you seem to provide a little bit more detail about his movements on the day, and good detail about the Office of Emergency Management, OEM personnel, when they vacated, where they were. There were interesting stuff. But you mentioned that Rudy Giuliani's father was a convicted holdup criminal who had spent time in Sing Sing and had been associated with the mob in New York, and that his uncle was a mobster, and other people in his families were connected to the mafia. And so why has Rudy Giuliani never been, how did he ever get elected to the mayor of New York with these kind of connections? How come, he was portrayed as a hero? I realize maybe this is a little bit off topic here, but I was so shocked by this stuff about Rudy Giuliani. He's portrayed as the 9/11 hero, and yet he has all of these amazingly questionable connections. And of course, he's not the only one with these kind of connections. And when you do talk about the cleanup, you talk about a lot of mafia connections. Could you just talk a little bit about Rudy Giuliani?
Yeah, sure. The history of Harold Giuliani, who's his father, is I think commonly known. This wasn't something that I surprised anybody with. Harold Giuliani was this kind of two-bit thug that got put away in Sing Sing for a period of time, and then on Giuliani's mother's side, her brother and Giuliani's cousin were both. There's a good deal of evidence they're associated with the mob, but why was Giuliani then elected as mayor? Is first of all, you can't blame the sins of the father on the son. That's an old saying, and you can't blame the sins of the nephew and the cousin. And it's just a lot of circumstantial evidence, though. For this guy, it's a lot of circumstantial evidence that he does appear to come directly from the mob. Giuliani has a long history with the Department of Justice, though. He worked at the Department of Justice for years. He worked at the Southern District of New York as well. What's really interesting to me about Giuliani is that he worked for the law firms, White & Case, for example. White & Case is a famous old law firm that represented BCCI. Do you know the company, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, that was said to be the largest bank fraud in history? It wasn't really a bank fraud. It was a CIA world intelligence sort of black ops outfit that financed terrorists and so forth. And so Giuliani, as well as a lot of other characters that were right there in New York City involved in the events, were also involved in investigating BCCI. I mean, Michael Cherkasky, for example, was. He was at the time the chairman of Kroll at the time of 9/11, but he had been previously a assistant DA and investigated BCCI and a lot of other people. So that's what interests me about Giuliani. I get the impression from Giuliani's interview with Peter Jennings on the day of 9/11 that when he went ahead and said, we were told the buildings were going to come down, he admitted that he had foreknowledge in that sense. I get the impression from him that he was not deeply involved and didn't have deep knowledge of the operation itself. He just was told, get the heck out of the way and then shut up, or then play along or whatever. That's the impression I get. But there is another guy very closely associated with Giuliani named Bernard Kerik, who was the New York City Police Commissioner on 9/11 and also considered a hero of the day. And Kerik, he just looks the part of a mobster. He was Giuliani's chauffeur in 1993, but in the 70s, and later he was an employee of the Saudi royal family, as well as an employee of, again, Morse and Knudsen in Saudi Arabia. So, he's just this thug. He ended up later becoming a chauffeur for Giuliani, then the Department of Corrections officer, and then the police commissioner of New York City. His police department provided that passport that magically fell by the wayside at the South Tower and was picked up and provided evidence for who the culprits were. But we really ought to be serious because Bernard Kerik is in jail right now, and he was accused of so many crimes it's just ridiculous, and he was ultimately thrown away. He's in jail right now, and so this guy who was clearly a mobster, clearly tied to Saudi Arabia, one of the most interesting things about Kerik is on the day of 9/11, and we're talking about very early, George Pataki, the governor, and Giuliani and Kerik show up on national television, and one of the first questions Giuliani gets from the press is, a lot of people are talking about secondary explosives. Were there explosions that helped bring down the World Trade Center buildings? And Giuliani looks around like stunned, and he looks back to Kerik for the answer. I'm not kidding. And Bernard Kerik shakes his head, no, there were no explosives. So that's when we got the first official answer that there were no explosives used on 9/11 from Bernard Kerik, who is now in jail. And I think we ought to maybe take a second look at that official explanation.
I think maybe some people at NIST may end up in jail alongside Kerik. So they've continued to say that no explosives were used. You did a marvelous article called "The Top 10 Connections Between NIST and Nanothermites." I consider this to be related here to your. Well, this is sort of bridges between your scientific and your deep penetration of this underworld. But talk about NIST's connections to nanothermites, which they deny were used, and they never even investigated.
Yeah, absolutely. The top 10 connections between NIST and nanothermite is the paper. That's at the Journal of 9/11 Studies, and it's been a couple of years. But I published that because I just really wondered how NIST could play dumb so well. How could they not think about nanothermite at all? Because they seem to have a lot of very well-qualified people who should have thought of that right away. And some of the people involved, for example, are the directors of NIST at the time. In October of 2001, Bush nominated a guy named Arden Beeman, who was a materials science engineer. I mean, he's the kind of guy that would know high-tech materials better than anybody. He had just come from Purdue University. Purdue had a thriving nanothermite program under a professor by the name of Stephen Sun, who came from Los Alamos National Laboratories. So Beeman really should have known. He had several other interesting connections, but then he was replaced by a guy named Harach Semerjian. And Semerjian not only had the background, but he wrote 10 papers with the world's leading expert on nanothermites, a guy named Michael Zachariah. Michael Zachariah has written more on nanothermites than anyone, I think, and he worked at the University of Minnesota for a while. Prior to that, he worked at NIST as well. So Michael Zachariah worked at NIST, but yet NIST can't figure out the possibilities of nanothermite. You know, whenever thermite was brought up to them over the years, they'd always say, "Oh, gee, that wouldn't make any sense. We'd have to have 1 million pounds of thermite," which obviously is not true. If anybody's seen the new video by my friend John Cole, who's also a board member at Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, he's got a video called "The Great Thermite Debate." And you can find it on 9/11 Blogger, and he shows that all these people who said you need all these gazillion pounds of thermite are crazy, and that people who said thermite can't cut steel columns are crazy because he did it up in his backyard. So obviously it can be done, and it can be done very efficiently. But Harach Semerjian wrote this paper, then these 10 papers with this world's leading expert on nanothermite. Then we go into the company that provided the largest contingent of non-government employees. This is a really interesting company. It's called Science Applications International Corporation, or SAIC. And SAIC, as I said, provided all these people to the NIST investigation. They're all listed. This huge group of people are listed in the report as being authors of the report, essentially. But SAIC has this long history at the World Trade Center. In 1986, they did an evaluation of threats to the World Trade Center, and they proposed that a big bomb in the basement, just exactly like the one that happened 7 years later in 1993, would do a lot of damage, right? So they provided this scenario, and in 1993, when it did happen, it was SAIC that provided the official explanation for what happened. And then in 2001, they're hired after 2001 to help NIST write this report on what happened on 9/11. But SAIC, they make nanothermites. They're a huge corporation, but they have a subsidiary called Applied Ordnance Technology that not only makes nanothermites, they specialize in laser ignition of nanothermites. And they also are involved in projects where they dole out money for research on nanothermites. So, but SAIC is just really interesting because it's this intelligence contractor. That's what they're known for the most part. They even spy on the CIA. The CIA hires SAIC to spy on their employees. It's a little bit crazy. SAIC provided evidence to kind of prove that Iraq needed to be invaded. The evidence against Saddam. They provided the evidence. They provided the evidence, the intelligence evidence for the capture of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. They trained the Saudi Navy. They have employees like Robert Gates, who's our current defense secretary. They did. Jerome Hauer, who was the OEM director at the World Trade Center. John Deutsch was a CIA director, and so on and so on.
So
they're basically the CIA. That's who they are.
And they're in there as the biggest outside component in NIST, while NIST is doing its reports on the towers and on
right.
WTC7 as well?
That's right. Yeah, and so it's crazy that they could be so connected to the history of the World Trade Center and everything that happened to it, and all the evidence for what's happened over the last 10 years, and have all these CIA directors working for them, and so forth, and people just say, oh, that's all right, no problem at all. SAIC gave us the official explanation for what happened to the World Trade Center.